You were never broken. You were being built. There is a kind of quiet that follows a person after they've survived something most people never see. Not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of aftermath. The stillness that settles in once the noise of struggle finally fades. If you are reading this, you probably know that quiet. You have felt it in your own chest, late at night, when the world was asleep and you were still awake, wondering if anyone truly understood what you had carried. Let this be the moment where that question gets answered. You were never forgotten. You were never abandoned. You were being shaped, quietly, deliberately, in a way that only becomes visible long after the shaping is done. Think back to the hardest season of your life, the one you don't talk about much, the one that lives somewhere behind your eyes even when you're smiling. Maybe it was a betrayal that came from someone you trusted completely. Maybe it was a loss that arrived without warning and rearranged everything you thought you knew about your life. Maybe it was simply the slow, grinding weight of disappointment after disappointment, each one small enough to survive but heavy enough to leave a mark. Whatever it was, you carried it. Not perfectly, not without cracking, but you carried it. And that matters more than you've ever given yourself credit for. Most people measure strength by how loud someone's recovery looks, how quickly they bounce back, how impressive their comeback story sounds to an audience. But real strength rarely performs. It shows up in the version of you that got out of bed on a morning when nothing made sense. It shows up in the phone call you didn't make out of anger, the words you swallowed instead of using as weapons. The version of yourself you refused to become even when it would have been easier. Nobody applauded you for that. There was no ceremony. But it happened, and it counted. And it kept happening, quietly, day after day, in ways too small for anyone else to notice, but too significant for you to ever fully forget. That accumulation of small refusals, the refusal to give up, the refusal to become cruel, the refusal to let despair have the final word, is the real architecture of who you are now. Nobody builds a life in a single dramatic moment. They build it in 1,000 unremarkable ones, and you have already built more of that architecture than you realize. At some point in your struggle, there were probably people who expected less of you than you expected of yourself. Maybe they said it outright. Maybe they just showed it, in the way they stopped calling, in the way their support quietly evaporated the moment things got difficult, in the way they seemed almost comfortable watching you struggle. Here is the truth that's easy to forget in the middle of pain. Their doubt was never a measurement of your worth. It was a reflection of their own limitations, of how far their imagination could stretch to believe in someone else's resilience. People often cannot see in others what they have never had to find in themselves. You don't need their applause now, and you didn't need their belief then. What you needed, and what you found, somewhere in the wreckage, was your own. That's the part worth honoring. Not the moment someone else finally noticed you'd made it through, but the moment you decided, quietly and without an audience, that you weren't finished yet. It's worth being clear about something here too. This isn't about keeping score with the people who doubted you, or waiting for the satisfaction of proving them wrong. That kind of motivation runs out eventually, because it depends on other people paying attention to your life in order for your progress to feel meaningful. The healthier version of this is quieter. It doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need anyone's changed opinion to validate it. You get to decide on your own terms what your effort has been worth, and that decision belongs entirely to you. There's a temptation, when life gets hard enough, to search for some grand cosmic reason behind it all, to believe that pain has been assigned to you specifically, that you were singled out for a harder road so that you could become someone extraordinary. That idea can be comforting, but it isn't necessary for your pain to mean something. What's true, without needing any mysticism to back it up, is simpler and just as powerful. Difficulty reveals capacity. You didn't discover your resilience by reading about it, you discovered it by needing it. The version of you that exists now, steadier, more discerning, less easily shaken by other people's opinions, was built the only way that version of a person can be built: through repetition, through friction, through choosing to keep going when quitting would have been easier and no one would have blamed you. This isn't about glorifying suffering. Pain is not a gift, and no one should have to go looking for it in order to grow. But when it comes, and it comes for everyone eventually, what you do with it is where your story actually begins to belong to you. There's a difference between the hardship itself and what you make of it. The hardship isn't the achievement. Plenty of people go through terrible things and never grow an inch from them, not because they lacked strength, but because growth was never automatic in the first place. It has to be chosen, again and again, often quietly, often without any dramatic turning point to mark it. If you've grown through what you went through, that growth was earned. It didn't arrive as compensation for your suffering. You built it, deliberately, out of raw material that was never asked for and never fair. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with going through something nobody else can fully understand. You try to explain it, and the words fall short. You look around and realize that even people who love you can only offer sympathy, not comprehension. So you learn to sit with it alone. That silence can feel like punishment. It isn't. It's often the space where the most important internal work happens, the work no one can do for you and no one can witness. In that silence, you learned things about yourself that comfort would never have taught you. You learned what you can tolerate. You learned what you refuse to become, even under pressure. You learned the difference between the things worth fighting for and the things worth releasing. None of that comes from being surrounded by noise and reassurance. It comes from being alone with your own thoughts long enough to finally hear them clearly. There's also something worth saying about how that silence changes a person's relationship to reassurance itself. Before, maybe you needed constant confirmation that things would be okay. A phone call, a kind word, some external sign that you were on the right track. After going through prolonged silence, many people find they no longer need that in the same way. Not because they stopped caring what others think, but because they built an internal steadiness that doesn't collapse the moment outside validation goes quiet. That's not coldness, that's self-sufficiency. And it's one of the more valuable things a difficult season can leave behind. Here is something worth sitting with honestly. Surviving hardship does not automatically make a person better. Plenty of people go through difficult things and come out the other side harder, colder, more suspicious of everyone around them, quicker to protect themselves at the expense of connection. That's an understandable response to pain. It's also, quietly, a kind of loss. A loss of the openness that made life feel worth living in the first place. If you're reading this and you can honestly say that you still care, that you still hope, that you still choose kindness even after everything that tried to convince you not to, that is not a small thing. That is the actual victory. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of your humanity despite them. It would have been easier in some ways to close yourself off. Cynicism is a kind of armor. But you chose something harder and rarer. You stayed soft in the places that mattered, even while growing tougher in the places that needed it. That combination, strength without hardness, wisdom without suspicion, is not common. Protect it. It's one of the most valuable things you have. This doesn't mean the anger or the bitterness never showed up at all. Of course it did. You're human, and no one moves through real pain without touching those feelings at some point. The difference isn't whether you felt them, it's whether you let them settle in and take up permanent residence, or whether you let them pass through and kept moving. Feeling bitterness for a season is not a failure. Building your entire identity around it is the thing worth guarding against. And if you've managed to avoid that, you've done something genuinely difficult. There is often a moment, in the middle of a difficult season, that feels like the absolute bottom, the point where everything you built seems to collapse at once, where you genuinely wonder if you'll recover. In hindsight, for many people, that moment turns out to be less of an ending and more of a clearing. The old structure had to come down before anything more honest could be built in its place. This doesn't mean the collapse didn't hurt. It did. Grief for what was lost is real and deserves space, not denial. But if you look closely at your own story, you might notice that the version of your life that exists now, however imperfect, however still under construction, is standing on ground that only became visible once the old illusions cleared away. What felt like falling apart was, more accurately, falling into a truer shape. Painful, yes, but not meaningless. Sometimes the things that fall apart during a hard season were never actually stable to begin with. relationships built on convenience rather than genuine care, plans built on assumptions that were never quite true, a version of yourself that was performing confidence rather than actually feeling it. Losing those things can feel indistinguishable from losing something valuable, especially in the moment. It's only with distance that the difference becomes clear. Some collapses are demolitions of things that needed to go, even if you weren't ready to let them go on your own. Somewhere along the way, many of us absorb the idea that scars, emotional or otherwise, are things to be ashamed of, evidence of damage that should be concealed rather than acknowledged. That idea does a disservice to what scars actually represent. A scar means something happened and you survived it. It means the wound closed. It means the story continued instead of ending there. There is nothing weak about that. If anything, a person without any scars at all is a person who has never truly been tested, and there is no wisdom in that kind of untouched life, only an experience. You don't need to advertise your scars to everyone you meet, and you don't need to turn your pain into a performance for sympathy. But you also don't need to hide from yourself the fact that you have been through something and made it to the other side. That fact is allowed to be a quiet source of confidence, even if no one else ever knows the full story behind it. There's a kind of quiet recognition that happens between people who have both been through something difficult, even when the details of what they've survived are completely different. It shows up as patience with each other's rough edges, as an unspoken understanding that doesn't need to be explained. That recognition is one of the unexpected gifts of having scars in the first place. It makes you legible, in a way, to other people who are carrying their own. It's worth being honest about something uncomfortable. The people we tend to admire most, for their depth, their wisdom, their steadiness under pressure, are almost never the people who had the easiest lives. They're the people who went through something difficult and let it refine them instead of ruin them. This isn't an argument for seeking out hardship, and it certainly isn't a suggestion that suffering is required to become a good person. But it is a reminder that if your path has been harder than you expected, that difficulty is not disqualifying you from a meaningful life. It may well be equipping you for one. Depth of character tends to come from depth of experience, and depth of experience is rarely comfortable while it's happening. If you find that people now come to you for steadiness, for perspective, for the kind of calm that only comes from having weathered real storms, that isn't an accident. That's the return on everything you went through, even the parts you wish you could have skipped. There's also a kind of usefulness to hardship that only becomes visible in hindsight, and only when you're in a position to help someone else through something similar. Advice from someone who has never actually struggled tends to sound thin, no matter how well-intentioned it is. Advice from someone who has actually been there carries a different weight entirely, because it comes with evidence behind it. If you ever find yourself sitting across from someone going through what you once went through, you'll understand exactly what your difficult season was quietly preparing you to offer. One of the quieter pressures that comes after surviving something difficult is the expectation to demonstrate your recovery in a way that satisfies other people's curiosity, to prove, visibly and convincingly, that you're okay now. You don't owe anyone that performance. Healing is rarely linear, and it's almost never as tidy as it looks from the outside. You are allowed to have good days and hard days without either one canceling out the other. You are allowed to have moved forward in some parts of your life while still working through others. There is no deadline on this, and there is no audience whose approval you need to earn by healing on a schedule that makes sense to them. The only person whose sense of your progress actually matters is you. Measure it honestly, without exaggerating how far you've come, and without dismissing how far you actually have. It also helps to remember that healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like ordinary life, going to work, having a normal conversation, laughing at something small, without any of it being undercut by the weight you used to carry constantly. Recovery is often less about big visible transformations and more about the quiet return of ordinary moments, no longer being overshadowed by what you went through. That return, unremarkable as it might look from the outside, is worth noticing and worth being grateful for. If there's a next step after everything you've survived, it isn't necessarily about achieving something dramatic or proving anything to anyone who doubted you. It's simpler than that, and in some ways harder. It's about carrying what you've learned forward without letting it calcify into fear. Let your experience make you wiser, not more guarded to the point of shutting people out. Let it make you more discerning about who deserves your trust, not so suspicious that no one gets the chance to earn it. Let it make you more compassionate toward other people who are struggling in ways you recognize, because you know exactly how lonely that struggle can feel. The goal was never to come out of hardship unaffected. That's not possible, and it isn't even desirable. A person who felt nothing wouldn't have learned anything either. The goal is to come out of it still whole, still capable of connection, still willing to hope, even with the added weight of everything you now know about how hard life can be. This is, in some ways, an ongoing choice rather than a finished accomplishment. There will likely be moments in the future where the old instincts resurface. The instinct to close off, the instinct to assume the worst, the instinct to brace for disappointment before it even arrives. Those instincts aren't failures either. They're old habits, built in a hard season, that take time to soften even after the season has passed. Noticing them without judging yourself too harshly for having them is its own kind of progress. There's an interesting shift that happens after you've come through a hard season, one that's easy to miss because it happens slowly. The way people relate to you starts to change, not because you've announced anything, not because you've told your whole story to everyone who'll listen, but because something in how you carry yourself has quietly shifted. You react to setbacks differently now. You don't panic as easily. You've developed a kind of calm that other people notice even when they can't quite name where it came from. Some of the people who once expected you to fall apart are now, whether they'd admit it or not, a little unsettled by how steady you've become. That's not something you need to gloat about or even acknowledge directly. It's simply the natural result of having gone through something difficult and refusing to let it define you in the way they may have expected. Their surprise isn't your responsibility to manage. It's just evidence of a gap between what they assumed about you and what turned out to be true. At the same time, other people are drawn to that same steadiness for entirely different reasons. Not because they doubted you, but because they're going through their own version of a hard season, and they recognize something in you that gives them a little more courage to keep going. You may never know how many people have quietly taken strength from watching you refuse to quit. That influence doesn't require a stage or a speech. It just requires you continuing to be who you've become. One last thing worth saying. It's tempting, once you've survived something difficult, to let that survival become the whole story, to keep returning to it, retelling it, defining yourself permanently by what you overcame. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging it, and there's nothing wrong with drawing strength from it when you need to. But your life doesn't have to stay anchored there forever. The hard season was real, and what it taught you is real, but it isn't the entire book. It's a chapter, an important one, maybe even a defining one, but the pages keep turning whether you're ready or not. Giving yourself permission to build new chapters, ones that aren't primarily about what you survived, is its own kind of freedom. You get to be more than the hardest thing that ever happened to you. You always were. If you take nothing else from this, take this. The fact that you're still here, still trying, still caring, still willing to build something meaningful out of what you've been through, is not a small accomplishment. It might be the most significant thing about you. You don't need anyone else's permission to consider your own survival meaningful. You don't need a dramatic before and after story to prove that you've grown. And you certainly don't need to wait for the people who doubted you to notice the difference in order for that difference to be real. It already is real. You already did the work. And whatever comes next, you're not starting from nothing. You're starting from everything you've already learned how to carry. That is not the end of your story. It's simply the point where the harder chapters are finally behind you, and the ones you get to write on purpose are just beginning. Whatever you build from here doesn't have to be extraordinary in order to matter. It just has to be honestly yours, chosen deliberately, carried steadily, and lived without apology for everything it took to get here.